The first thing Mark Bishop said to me when the doctors were still stammering about his impossible return to life was a lie. A beautiful, magnificent lie that would save our parish but nearly shatter my own understanding of God's justice. A lie, yes, but not in the way you might think. It was a truth so profound, so utterly subversive to everything I had ever preached, everything I had believed about the cosmic scales of good and evil, that it felt like a deception. He had been a sinner of profound and unrepentant caliber, a man who mocked the very crucifix that hung in his long-suffering wife's kitchen. I'd seen him sneer at the collection plate, heard him dismiss the sacraments as ancient superstitions, witnessed his casual cruelty leave Maria, his devout wife, in tears more times than I could count in the confessional. For him to be dead for 47 minutes, nearly an hour, mind you, with no heartbeat, no breath, no flicker of brain activity, and then to return, sitting bolt upright with a serenity that chilled me to my core, describing celestial light and angelic choirs. It was not just medically impossible, it felt like a theological contradiction, a scandal that I, his parish priest, was now at the very epicenter of. The monitor behind him, that frantic, insistent little box of blinking lights and sharp tones, beeped with the steady, reassuring rhythm of a life that should not be. A life that, by every human and divine measure I understood, had forfeited its claim to such a miraculous reprieve. The doctors, their faces pale beneath the fluorescent hum of the ICU, moved like stunned automatons. They spoke in hushed clinical tones of spontaneous resuscitation, of anomalous brain activity recovery. But their eyes, those of seasoned professionals who had seen death's absolute finality countless times, betrayed a deeper, more profound bewilderment. They had no answers. I, a man of faith, was supposed to have answers, but I had only questions, each one a hammer blow to the foundations of my certainty. How could this be? I gripped the worn rosary beads in my pocket, their familiar smoothness offering no comfort. Mark Bishop. This Mark Bishop. He was not just a nominal Catholic, not merely lapsed. He was an adversary, a scoffer, a man who built his empire on the backs of others, then laughed at the notion of eternal judgment. He lived his life as if God were a quaint, irrelevant myth, a crutch for the weak, a fiction for the foolish. And now this same man, resurrected from the very threshold of death's dark door, claimed to have been ushered into the most glorious chambers of heaven itself. It was an affront, a cosmic joke, a shattering defiance of everything I understood about divine justice, about the path to salvation, about the very mechanics of grace. My mind raced, tumbling through scripture, through centuries of theological teaching, searching for a precedent, a parable, any shred of wisdom that could reconcile what I saw with what I knew. There was none. Only this raw, unbelievable event, unfolding before me in a sterile room filled with the scent of antiseptic and the ghostly tang of absolute disbelief. The sheer audacity of it, the impossible grace bestowed upon a man who, if anyone, seemed destined for a different, far less comforting eternity. His gaze, when it met mine, was no longer sharp and cynical. It was soft, luminous, brimming with an inexplicable peace. He spoke, not of fear, not of a second chance, but of a profound, undeniable experience of love. He spoke of beauty beyond comprehension, of light that healed, of a presence that was both intimate and infinite. He described it all with a quiet authority that silenced the very air in the room, making even the frantic beeping of his monitor seem like a distant, irrelevant whisper. And I, Father Michael, servant of God, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. This was not the orderly, righteous universe I had dedicated my life to. This was chaos, divine and beautiful, but chaos nonetheless. Had God just granted a vision of heaven to a man who, by all accounts, had earned a place anywhere but? Had all our prayers, all our efforts, all our striving for holiness been rendered moot by a single inexplicable act of mercy so vast it swallowed all prior expectation? I stood there, a witness to a miracle that felt like a challenge, a profound interrogation of my own faith. This wasn't just about Mark Bishop's soul. It was about the soul of our parish, about the very nature of God's plan, about whether I had been preaching the right God all along. This impossible return, this scandalous vision of heaven, was either the greatest test of my faith or its most radical redefinition. And as Mark's steady heartbeat continued its impossible rhythm, I knew with chilling certainty that nothing in my life or in the life of our quiet little town would ever be the same again. This was a story I had to tell, a revelation I had to share, even if it meant confronting the terrifying possibility that everything I thought I knew was profoundly, magnificently wrong. Indeed, nothing in my life, or in the life of our quiet little town, would ever be the same again. That much was certain. But to truly grasp the seismic shift that occurred, to comprehend the audacious generosity of God's grace in that small, breathless hospital room, one must first understand the man Mark Bishop was before he died, before his heart stopped, and then impossibly began again. One must confront the spiritual chasm he embodied, the profound, almost defiant emptiness that defined his existence in our quiet community of St. Jude. Before the event that would forever etch itself into the soul of our small parish, before the miracle that splintered the hard shell of his cynicism and revealed a vulnerability few believed existed, Mark Bishop was, simply put, a force of nature. But he was not the gentle, life-giving force of a spring rain, nor the comforting warmth of a summer sun. Mark was a hurricane, a relentless, churning entity that swept through St. Jude, rearranging landscapes both physical and emotional, often leaving behind a trail of unease and a sense of having been thoroughly, if subtly, diminished. In my years as Father Michael, I had guided many souls, gentle and troubled, fervent and lapsed. But Mark was singular. He was a man who commanded a room not through warmth or charisma, but through an almost palpable aura of self-assured dominion. His presence was like a sudden drop in temperature, silencing casual chatter, drawing all eyes to his unyielding form. His voice, deep and resonant, was usually employed to issue directives, to cut through what he perceived as sentimental clutter, or, regrettably, to mock what he deemed weakness, particularly the kind he associated with faith. My understanding of Mark, perhaps ironically, came not directly from him, for he rarely darkened the doors of our church, save for obligatory, quickly exited Christmas Eve services, but from the raw, unfiltered anguish of his wife, Maria. Maria Bishop was a woman woven from prayer, a living rosary bead of unwavering faith and quiet, heartbreaking suffering. Her confessions were less a recounting of her own sins and more a tapestry of her enduring love for a man who seemed determined to tear down every spiritual edifice around them. She would speak of his cutting remarks at the dinner table, the way he would scoff with a dismissive wave of his hand when she spoke of parish events or the simple joys of our community life. She recalled, with a tremor in her voice, his almost deliberate choice to schedule golf games for Sunday mornings, not out of a fervent passion for the sport, but out of a calculated, almost theatrical desire to highlight his absolute detachment from our community of faith. Her tears, often silent, would well in her eyes as she described his public pronouncements against the church, his casual derision of what he called superstitious nonsense and a crutch for the weak. These weren't mere disagreements, they were direct assaults, designed to belittle, to isolate, and to dismantle the very foundations of her solace. He had built his fortune, a considerable one for our modest town, in real estate development. To Mark, the world was a chessboard, and people were pieces to be moved, sacrificed, or strategically deployed. His success was undeniable, carved from a landscape of shrewd deals, unwavering resolve, and a singular focus that bordered on the monomaniacal. He saw plots of land as mere commodities, not as places where families dreamed or where communities blossomed. They were acreage to be optimized, transformed into profit, and he viewed people in much the same way, as assets if they served his purpose, liabilities if they stood in his way, or most often, as mere background noise in the grand narrative of his own ambition. I remember one parish meeting years ago when we were trying to raise funds for a new outreach centre for the town's growing population of struggling families. Mark, having been cornered by one of our more eternally optimistic parishioners, had attended purely, I suspected, out of a sense of obligation to his wife's public image, or perhaps a perverse curiosity. He listened, arms crossed, his posture radiating a quiet judgment, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. When, with a hopeful smile, he was asked to contribute, he had leaned forward, his eyes usually sharp and assessing, momentarily softening into something that might have been pity, or perhaps more accurately, disdain. "Father," he had said, his voice carrying just enough to silence the hopeful murmur of the room, "I invest in things that yield tangible returns. This is a charity, a black hole of sentimentality. I'm a businessman, not a dreamer." He then reached into his wallet and, with a flourish that made it seem like a grand gesture, wrote a check for a paltry sum, barely enough for a few hymnals, making sure everyone present saw how small it was relative to his known wealth. It was not just a public dismissal of our project, but of the very spirit of selfless giving, an ostentatious display of his worldly cynicism. His marriage to Maria, then, was a constant, cruel friction, like two tectonic plates grinding against each other beneath the surface of a supposedly tranquil domestic life. She, rooted in the ancient, comforting certainties of faith, saw life as a sacred journey towards God, a pilgrimage of love, service, and spiritual growth. He, a pragmatic titan of the material world, saw it as a ladder to be climbed, each rung a testament to his own ingenuity, power, and capacity for self-reliance. There was no common ground, no shared spiritual horizon upon which they could meet and build a life together. He didn't just wander from the flock, he actively tried to tear down the fence on his way out, mocking the very shepherd, ridiculing the sheep, and dismissing the pasture as barren and irrelevant. I remember a particularly difficult Easter vigil, a time of profound spiritual renewal for our community, when Maria had come to me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from unshed tears. She had wanted their son, young Daniel, a quiet, sensitive boy, to participate more fully in the parish life, perhaps even to consider serving as an altar boy, to find some comfort in the sacred. Mark had forbidden it, not with an outburst of anger which would at least have been passionate, but with a cold, logical dismissiveness that was far more wounding. "He needs to focus on his studies, Maria," he had reportedly said, his tone devoid of emotion. "On things that will actually matter in the real world, not dressing up in costumes and pretending with dusty old books." It was not just an attack on her faith, but on the nascent stirrings of faith in their son, a son Maria prayed for with every beat of her gentle, enduring heart, a son who had watched his father chip away at his mother's deepest convictions for years. This was the core of Mark Bishop's tragedy. He was a man who had everything the world could offer, wealth beyond most local imagining, considerable influence within the town, a sharp, agile mind, and even a certain rugged handsomeness, but was, in the deepest and most profound sense, spiritually destitute. His life was a monument to pride and worldly success, a towering edifice built not on sand, but on a foundation of profound spiritual emptiness, a void he fiercely protected from any glimmer of divine light. He wore his atheism, or perhaps more accurately, his aggressive agnosticism, like a finely tailored suit, a badge of intellectual superiority and unassailable autonomy. He believed in himself, in his own power, and in the tangible results of his own relentless efforts. Anything else was to him a fantasy, a weakness to be exploited or more often simply ignored as irrelevant. As his parish priest, a shepherd tasked with guiding souls towards Christ, Mark Bishop was a source of profound anguish and a quiet, persistent challenge to my own understanding of God's boundless patience and inexhaustible mercy. How do you reach a man who has built an impregnable fortress around his soul, not out of fear or ignorance, but out of a fierce, unyielding conviction that he needs no saving, that he is, in fact, already complete? I often found myself in the quiet solitude of our rectory chapel, kneeling before the flickering lamp of the tabernacle, specifically for Mark. I didn't pray for his immediate conversion in the way one might pray for a repentant sinner seeking solace. No, for Mark, I prayed for a crack, a fissure, however minute, in the towering edifice of his self-sufficiency. I prayed for a whisper of doubt, a momentary chink in the armor of his certainty, a fleeting awareness of the spiritual hunger he so adamantly denied. I prayed too for Maria, whose unwavering fidelity to her faith, despite the constant spiritual assault from within her own home, was, in its own quiet way, a miracle in itself, a living testament to grace. I confess in those private moments, a terrifying thought sometimes crept into my prayers. Were some souls simply beyond reach? Were some hearts too hardened by the world's allure, too fortified by their own pride, to ever truly hear the quiet, persistent call of grace? It was a shadow across the radiant hope of the gospel, a doubt that tested the very core of my pastoral calling. His disdain for faith wasn't born of intellectual curiosity or genuine theological debate. It was a visceral rejection, a practical dismissal of anything that couldn't be quantified, leveraged, or profited from. He had no time for mystery, no patience for paradox, no room for the unseen hand of God. His world was solid, tangible, and explicable by human reason and ceaseless endeavor alone. And in that perfectly ordered, self-contained universe of his, there was simply no need, no space for God. He was, by his own design, utterly self-sufficient, a modern man standing tall against the ancient wisdom, believing himself to be the sole architect of his destiny. He scoffed at divine intervention, at the very notion of a higher power guiding human affairs, seeing it as the abdication of personal responsibility, a weakness. And in that ultimate act of spiritual independence, he had, perhaps unknowingly, placed himself beyond the very source of life itself, beyond the love that sustains all things. His heart, metaphorically speaking, had stopped long before the medical emergency, having ceased to beat in rhythm with the divine pulse of creation, having closed itself off to the breath of the Holy Spirit. He was, in the deepest sense, lost. A sheep not merely strayed from the flock, but one who had built a wall around himself, convinced he needed no shepherd. And it was precisely this profound, self-imposed estrangement, this stark spiritual desolation, that made what was to follow not merely astonishing but utterly devastatingly miraculous. It was into this deep, self-made darkness that the divine hand would reach. With an act of mercy so vast and so unexpected, it challenged every human expectation and every theological understanding I had ever held dear. The canvas was barren, the soil infertile, and yet into this desolation God was about to sow a seed of astonishing life. The Tuesday morning had begun much like any other, under the vast, indifferent expanse of God's sky, in our little town of St. Jude. Tuesdays were often quiet, a gentle pause between the bustling energy of Monday's fresh starts and the midweek momentum. For me, it meant a morning dedicated to scripture study in the rectory, the quiet rustle of old pages, the soft glow of the desk lamp even as the sun climbed higher. I was immersed in the epistles, contemplating the mysteries of divine love and human failing, when the jarring ring of the telephone cut through the peaceful silence. It was Maria. Her voice, usually soft and melodious even when laced with the quiet sorrow of her domestic life, was now a fractured, desperate cry, stripped of all composure. The words tumbled out, disjointed and raw, painting a picture of sudden, unimaginable chaos. Father Michael, it's Mark. He collapsed. He's gone. My heart seized, a cold dread snaking through me. Mark Bishop. The name alone had always carried a certain weight, a complicated echo in the corridors of my pastoral duties. He was a man who lived large, who consumed space and air with his booming voice and often cutting remarks. The notion of him collapsing, him being gone, felt utterly incongruous, like trying to imagine a roaring fire suddenly extinguished without so much as a wisp of smoke. Maria recounted the morning in frantic, fragmented sentences, each word a fresh wound. It had been, predictably, an argument. Their son, young David, had expressed a desire to be confirmed, to stand firm in the faith his mother held so dear. It was a beautiful, tender aspiration, a seed of grace pushing through the hardened earth of their household. But for Mark, it was simply another opportunity for conflict. Another expense for what he scornfully dismissed as superstitious nonsense. I could almost see the scene unfolding in their impeccably furnished, yet spiritually barren home. Maria, standing firm but trembling, her quiet devotion a stark contrast to Mark's bluster. The kitchen, usually the heart of a home, had become a battlefield. The crucifix, a simple wooden carving that Maria had hung above the sink despite Mark's derision, would have silently borne witness. Mark, I imagined, would have been red-faced, his prominent brow furrowed in a familiar scowl, his voice a bellow that made the very windows tremble. He would have thrown a stack of bills onto the polished granite counter, the crisp paper scattering like leaves in a storm. "I won't pay for this charade, Maria, not a penny. It's ridiculous, a waste of money and time. Fill his head with practical sense, not with fairy tales." And then, as if struck by an invisible hand, he simply collapsed. No warning, no fading, just a sudden, brutal crumpling of his formidable frame. One moment, a man raging against God, against faith, against the very foundations of his wife's soul. The next, a heavy, silent heap on the pristine floor. Maria's screams, she later told me, were primal, tearing from a place she didn't know existed within her. She fumbled with the phone, her fingers numb, dialing 911. Then, in a desperate, unthinking act of pure instinct, she called me. Not to administer last rites, for she knew, with the chilling certainty of those first responders who had arrived moments later, that there was no life left to anoint. No, she called simply for a presence, a witness to her shattering world, a spiritual anchor in a sea of absolute despair. "Father," she wept, her voice so thin it seemed it might snap. "They said he was gone. Before they even got here, they said he's gone." The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Gone. A man who had so defiantly been present, so utterly alive in his rejection of the sacred, now reduced to an absence. I found myself gripping the phone receiver until my knuckles ached, my mind racing, struggling to reconcile the boisterous, challenging Mark Bishop I knew with the profound stillness Maria's words implied, a knot of grief, confusion, and a strange, profound sense of inadequacy twisted in my gut. What prayers does one offer for a man who, by all outward appearances, had so resolutely refused to acknowledge the need for them? I drove to the hospital in a daze, the familiar streets of St. Jude blurring past my car window. The sun, which had been so bright when I started my scripture reading, now seemed too brazen, too indifferent to the sudden tragedy that had befallen one of its own. My thoughts were a turbulent prayer, a desperate plea for understanding. Maria's image, tear-streaked and broken, flashed before my eyes. My heart ached for her, for the quiet suffering she had endured for so many years, for the grace she had embodied in the face of such relentless spiritual opposition. And for Mark, I felt a complex mix of sorrow and a profound, unsettling apprehension. As a priest, I have stood at countless bedsides, ministering to the dying, offering the comforting balm of absolution, the anointing oil that seals a soul for its journey home. I had administered last rites to saints and sinners alike, always with the unwavering belief in God's infinite mercy, even at the 11th hour. But Mark Bishop had not reached out. He had not sought solace. He had not, as far as any of us knew, uttered a single prayer of repentance. He had died in the midst of a tirade against the very faith that now called me to his side. The irony was as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. The hospital corridors, usually a hive of controlled activity, seemed to amplify the silence of my own thoughts. The scent of antiseptic, the low hum of unseen machinery, the distant murmur of voices, all the mundane details of a place perpetually teetering between life and death, registered with a heightened, almost painful clarity. I found Maria in the waiting room just outside the emergency bay, a small, desolate figure huddled on a stiff plastic chair. Her face was swollen, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant, yet there was a fierce, almost defiant glint within them. She wasn't just grieving. She was fighting a silent battle with despair itself. "Father," she whispered, rising slowly, as if the weight of the world pressed down upon her. She clung to my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging slightly into my sleeve, a physical anchor for a soul adrift. "They're still in there. They're still trying." I followed her gaze to the double doors of the ER, which periodically swung open to reveal fleeting glimpses of controlled chaos. The sounds were muted now, less the frantic shouts of resuscitation and more the quiet, focused efficiency of a team winding down. My stomach churned. I knew what this meant. The frantic life-saving efforts had likely already ceased. This was the grim, inevitable transition from emergency care to the somber preparations for what followed. Stepping into the emergency room was like entering a different dimension, a realm suspended between this life and the next. The air was thick with the residue of intense effort, the metallic tang of blood and adrenaline. The fluorescent lights hummed with a cold, unforgiving brilliance, casting stark shadows. And there on a gurney in the center of the room lay Mark. He looked smaller. The man who had filled every room with his presence was now just a body, covered partially by a thin sheet. His face, usually ruddy and expressive, was pale, almost ashen, already losing the vibrant flush of life. His eyes were closed, his lips slightly parted in a silent, eternal sigh. The medical team moved around him with a practiced, almost ritualistic quietness. There were two nurses, their faces tired and drawn, disconnecting various tubes and wires. A young doctor, perhaps in his early 30s, stood near Mark's head holding a clipboard, his shoulders slumped in a posture of resigned exhaustion. I knew this doctor, Dr. Peterson. He was relatively new to St. Jude's Hospital, bright and earnest, but his eyes, even from a distance, held that particular sheen of practiced sorrow, the kind of grief that comes not from personal loss, but from witnessing it too often, from the daily confrontation with the limits of human science. He caught my eye, a flicker of recognition passing between us, and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was a gesture of profound finality, a silent acknowledgement that all had been done, and all had failed. Maria, beside me, let out a soft, broken sob that was quickly stifled, as if she feared disturbing the grim reverence of the moment. I placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through her. My gaze fell upon the cardiac monitor next to Mark's gurney. It was still plugged in, though perhaps overlooked in the urgency of the moment. And on its screen, a flat, unwavering line stretched across the dark expanse, a terrifyingly stark testament to the absence of a pulse, the cessation of a beat. No jagged peaks, no frantic oscillations, just the quiet, endless hum of zero activity. It screamed of an emptiness I found profoundly disturbing. I watched the young doctor approach Mark's side, his movements deliberate, almost hesitant. He checked a wrist, then placed a stethoscope to the still chest, listening intently to what he already knew was not there. The silence in the room became almost unbearable, a tangible weight pressing down on us all. When he finally straightened up, his face was etched with a profound, almost weary sadness. He looked at Maria, then at me, and his voice, though gentle, carried the undeniable authority of a verdict. "Mrs. Bishop," he began, his tone soft yet unwavering, We did everything we could. For over 30 minutes we performed CPR, we administered all protocols. There was no response, no heart activity, no respiration, no brainstem reflexes. He paused, taking a slow breath, as if steeling himself for the words that must follow. "I'm so very sorry. Mr. Bishop was gone before the paramedics arrived. We officially pronounced the time of death at 9:17 a.m. The words hung in the sterile air, each one a hammer blow. No response, no heart activity. Gone. Pronounced time of death. Maria crumpled, her knees giving way. I caught her, my arm around her shaking shoulders, pulling her gently against me. Her cries were no longer stifled. They were guttural, raw expressions of a grief too vast to contain. She wept not just for her husband, but for the years of unspoken words, for the soul she had so desperately prayed for, now, it seemed, lost to her forever. I held her close, my own eyes stinging. This was it, the final, crushing blow. Her life ended, abruptly, without warning, without reconciliation. A man so full of earthly vitality, now utterly inert. The theological contradictions that had simmered in my mind since Maria's call now boiled over, scalding me with doubt. Could a lifetime of dismissive pride, of outright rejection, truly be reconciled in an instant of unexpected death? Could the prayers of a devout wife, however fervent, truly breach such a chasm of unbelief? The weight of Mark's spiritual unpreparedness pressed down on me, heavier than any physical burden. In that sterile, brightly lit room, amidst the quiet despair of Maria and the grim finality of the medical pronouncement, I felt a deep, profound sense of defeat. Not just for Maria, not just for Mark, but for the very fabric of my understanding of divine justice, of human salvation. It seemed at that moment that all the hope and all the prayers had come too late. The curtain had fallen, and the silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating, and utterly devoid of anything resembling grace. It was the silence of an ending, an absolute, irrefutable end. The silence that had fallen upon us, an absolute, irrefutable end just moments before, began to fracture not with a scream or a sob, but with a stirring of spirit so profound, so utterly defiant, that it startled me more than any outward expression of grief. My own heart, still reeling from the grim pronouncement, felt a leaden ache. My mind, a priest's mind, struggled to reconcile the finality of Mark's physical death with the theological questions his unrepentant life raised. Justice, mercy, salvation, they swirled in a chaotic eddy, scalding me with doubt. Could a lifetime of dismissive pride, of outright rejection, truly be reconciled in an instant of unexpected death? Could the prayers of a devout wife, however fervent, truly breach such a chasm of unbelief? The weight of Mark's spiritual unpreparedness pressed down on me, heavier than any physical burden. In that sterile, brightly lit room, amidst the quiet despair of Maria and the grim finality of the medical pronouncement, I felt a deep, profound sense of defeat. Not just for Maria, not just for Mark, but for the very fabric of my understanding of divine justice, of human salvation. It seemed at that moment that all the hope and all the prayers had come too late. The curtain had fallen, and the silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating, and utterly devoid of anything resembling grace. It was the silence of an ending, an absolute, irrefutable end. But Maria, bless her indomitable spirit, refused to let that curtain fall completely. Her face, tear-streaked and pale, was nonetheless set with a resolve that seemed to radiate from a source beyond human despair. She had watched the doctor's lips form the final words, had seen the respectful, sorrowful nods of the nurses, had perhaps even registered the quiet rustle of paper as the death certificate began its inevitable journey. Yet in her eyes there was not the surrender I felt, but a different, fiercer light, a light of absolute, uncompromising faith. She turned to me, her gaze piercing through my own cloud of professional sorrow and personal doubt. Her hand, surprisingly strong for a woman of her delicate frame, shot out and seized my arm. Her grip was tight, urgent, a physical manifestation of her spiritual tenacity. It was not a plea for comfort, not a desperate cry, but an instruction, clear and unyielding. "We have to pray, Father," she insisted, her voice raw, raspy from stifled sobs, yet imbued with an authority that brooked no argument. It wasn't a question, it was a command issued from the very depths of a faith that defied the incontrovertible reality unfolding around us. I remember the slight shock of her touch, the jolt of her conviction against my own spiritual weariness. My instinct, honed by years of ministering to the dying and the bereaved, was to offer words of consolation, to lead her gently through the initial stages of grief. But Maria was not asking for comfort. She was demanding action. She knew, as I did, what the doctors had said. She understood the finality of their pronouncements. Her Mark was gone. There was no medical reversal to be hoped for, no miraculous resuscitation to anticipate. Her words, "We have to pray," were not for his physical return, but for something far deeper, far more eternal. She prayed for his soul. She prayed for mercy. She didn't wait for my agreement. With that same fierce grip on my arm, she pulled me, not towards the door to leave the hospital, not towards the family waiting room, but towards the faint, almost forgotten sign pointing down a dim corridor. Hospital Chapel. The movement was an assertion, a testament to her belief that even in this citadel of modern science, God's presence was the only true refuge. The journey down that long, sterile hallway felt like a passage between two worlds. On one side, the hushed efficiency of the medical staff, the muted beeps of distant machines, the cold, clinical reality of death. On the other, Maria, a beacon of defiant faith, dragging a priest laden with doubt towards a small room that promised only spiritual solace. Each step was a silent battle within me. How could I pray with conviction for a man who had so vehemently rejected everything I stood for? How could I ask for mercy for a soul that seemed to have scorned the very notion of it? Yet Maria's grip was unwavering, and my duty, both as a priest and as a witness to such profound faith, compelled me forward. The hospital chapel, when we finally reached it, was a modest space, tucked away almost apologetically at the end of the corridor. It was a haven of quietude, a stark contrast to the low hum of the hospital around us. The air within was different, not sterile, but still, carrying a faint, lingering scent of old incense and beeswax, a testament to countless prayers offered within its walls. The lighting was soft, diffused through a stained glass window depicting a simple dove, casting gentle, muted colors across the polished wooden pews. A plain, unadorned crucifix hung above a small altar, its figure of Christ gazing down with a quiet, enduring suffering. It was a space designed for solace, for introspection, for a whispered conversation with the divine. Maria released my arm as we entered, moving with a singular purpose towards the altar rail. She didn't hesitate, didn't look around. She simply knelt, her body collapsing onto the worn kneeler with an almost physical sigh of surrender, not to grief, but to prayer. Her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly, she began to murmur, though I couldn't yet discern the words. Her whole posture was an act of profound humility, an emptying of self before the divine mystery. I knelt beside her, the hard wood of the kneeler pressing against my knees, a familiar ache that was both physical and spiritual. Humbled by her fierce devotion, I found my own doubts beginning to recede, if only for a moment, in the face of such raw, unshakable faith. Maria's belief was a balm to my weary soul, a gentle rebuke to my intellectual struggles. She wasn't theologizing, she was simply believing. She wasn't seeking answers, she was seeking grace. I watched her for a moment, my own prayers still forming, still hesitant. Her lips moved silently, forming words that were too intimate, too raw for me to overhear. Yet I could sense the absolute outpouring of her heart. She was pouring out her pain, her love, her desperate hope that the God she served so faithfully would meet Mark, wherever he was, with the same boundless mercy she had always believed in. It wasn't a plea for a miracle of resuscitation. Maria was too grounded in her faith, too accepting of God's will to demand a reversal of death. No, this was a prayer for the unseen journey, for the soul's passage, for the eternal destiny of a man who had strayed so far. As I closed my eyes, trying to align my wavering spirit with her unwavering one, the chapel door creaked open softly, then again and again. One by one, quietly, reverently, others began to enter. News travels quickly in a small town, especially news as devastating as Mark Bishop's sudden death. And St. Jude's, our little parish, was a tightly knit community. Even for those who had felt the sting of Mark's sharp tongue or witnessed his casual disdain for their beliefs. They came drawn by a mixture of concern for Maria, a sense of Christian duty, and perhaps a flicker of that same defiant hope Maria embodied. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, her face etched with concern, who had served on the altar guild with Maria for decades. There was young Thomas, the altar server, who Mark had once publicly ridiculed for wanting to join the seminary, even Mr. Henderson, a local businessman who had tangled with Mark over a contentious land deal, entered with a solemn expression, his usual gruffness softened by the gravity of the situation. They were a microcosm of our parish, ordinary people called to an extraordinary act of communal faith. They hadn't come for gossip or morbid curiosity, they had come to pray. They saw Maria kneeling, her form a silhouette against the diffused light, and without a word, they understood. They found empty pews, knelt and bowed their heads. There was no need for instruction, no need for explanation. The unspoken language of shared grief and shared faith filled the small room. Then Maria's voice, still raw but now stronger, broke the stillness. "Hail Mary, full of grace," she began, her fingers finding the familiar smooth beads of a rosary she must have carried with her always. Her voice, though strained, was clear, a gentle clarion call. I joined her, my own voice a little shaky at first, but quickly finding its rhythm, its familiar cadence. "The Lord is with thee." And then the others joined in, a soft murmur at first, growing into a unified chorus. The Rosary, the age-old prayer, a meditative journey through the mysteries of Christ's life, guided by the loving intercession of his mother. We began with the glorious mysteries, traditionally prayed on Wednesdays and Sundays, but chosen now, perhaps instinctively, for the profound hope they represented. The resurrection, the ascension, Pentecost, the Assumption, and the coronation. Each bead, each Hail Mary, was a whisper of belief against the resounding echo of death. Each Our Father, each Glory Be, was an offering, a plea for divine intervention, not in the realm of the physical, but in the boundless domain of the spiritual. As our voices rose and fell, a wave of comfort began to wash over my own weary heart. The communal prayer was a powerful thing. It was no longer just Maria and I, wrestling with the impossible. It was a community, united in faith, interceding on behalf of one of its own, even a challenging, wayward one. We weren't praying for a medical reversal. We were commending the soul of a difficult man to the infinite mercy of God. My mind still wrestled with Mark's life, with his pride, his scorn, his often cruel dismissal of the very faith that now held his wife and his community in its embrace. But as the rhythm of the rosary filled the chapel, bead by bead, mystery by mystery, a subtle shift occurred within me. The suffocating silence of defeat from the ER began to lift, replaced by a different kind of silence, a hopeful, expectant hush. It was the silence not of an ending, but of a waiting on God. The petitions we offered for each mystery took on a deeper resonance. For the resurrection, we prayed that Mark's soul might rise to eternal life. For the ascension, that he might be lifted to God's heavenly kingdom. For Pentecost, that the Holy Spirit might purify whatever remnants of sin clung to his soul. Each prayer was a tiny act of spiritual defiance against the finality we had just witnessed. It was a radical act of hope. I looked around at the faces of the parishioners. Some had their eyes closed in deep concentration. Others gazed at the crucifix, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and peace. Their presence alone was a testament to the power of Maria's faith and to the deep, often unseen bonds that held our parish together. They knew Mark. Many of them had been hurt by him. Yet here they were, offering their most fervent prayers for his salvation. It was Christian charity in its purest form, the scent of old wood, the soft light, the hushed voices weaving the ancient prayers. It all created a sacred bubble, a fragile shield against the harsh realities outside. Within these walls, death was not the absolute end. Within these walls, there was still hope, still the promise of God's boundless mercy. It was a hope not rooted in earthly desires, but in the audacious belief that God's love truly is stronger than death, stronger than sin, stronger even than the most hardened heart. We were not praying for Mark to live. We were praying that Mark, in death, might truly begin to live in the grace and mercy of the God he had so publicly denied. The air thickened with our collective spiritual effort, a quiet plea rising to the heavens, not for a reprieve from the inevitable, but for an embrace beyond the veil. The air thickened with our collective spiritual effort, a quiet plea rising to the heavens, not for a reprieve from the inevitable, but for an embrace beyond the veil. It wasn't merely the closeness of bodies in the small chapel that made the air feel heavy. It was the unspoken weight of our intercession, each whispered prayer, each silent yearning for mercy, adding a palpable density to the space around us. We had finished the glorious mysteries, the final Amen hanging in the quiet chapel, a whisper of a word heavy with both supplication and surrender, echoing softly against the cool stone walls. It seemed to linger, a fragile yet insistent offering in the face of an insurmountable truth. 47 minutes. It is a number that, in the sterile lexicon of medicine, marks an eternity when you are measuring the space between a life and what comes after. It is the span of time during which the doctors down the hall had declared Mark Bishop's heart irrevocably silent, his breath stilled, his brain activity ceased. And yet for us, in that small consecrated space, those minutes had stretched, pulled taut like an old violin string, vibrating with an unbearable stillness, a silence that hummed with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. Each moment seemed to expand, becoming a vast empty canvas upon which my mind painted vivid, often unsettling images. Outside the chapel, In the bustling labyrinth of the hospital, those 47 minutes had undoubtedly been marked by a practiced, grim efficiency. I pictured, with a chilling clarity that seemed to bypass the thick walls, the scene unfolding in the emergency room. The bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights would still be humming, casting stark, almost surgical shadows that seemed to strip color and warmth from everything they touched. Their stark glare would fall upon Mark's body, once a vessel of boisterous life and unyielding will, now lying utterly still on the gurney, his face, I imagined, already taking on the waxy pallor of absence. The complex machines that had, for a fleeting time, tracked the frantic dance of his failing organs, the cardiac monitor's frantic peaks and valleys, a chaotic symphony of life struggling for purchase, the ventilator's rhythmic sigh, like a dying whisper, would now be silent. Their screens, once a kaleidoscope of urgent vital signs, would display only flat, unwavering lines, cold scientific pronouncements of absence, a stark testament to the finality that had claimed him. I imagined the staff, their faces etched with a professional sorrow, moving with a respectful quiet that was itself a kind of reverence for the departed. The crisp rustle of their scrubs, the soft squeak of their shoes on the polished linoleum, the hushed murmur of their voices as they initiated the solemn, precise protocols for what comes after. They would be charting, recording, documenting the end of a life with meticulous care, preparing to move him, with a dignity born of routine, to the morgue. For them, it was over. For them, the narrative of Mark Bishop had concluded, a file closed, a chapter irrevocably sealed. The medical reality was a stone wall, unyielding and absolute. But in our small chapel, the narrative continued, albeit in a different register. Maria, her hands still clutching her rosary beads with a white-knuckled grip that spoke of a faith both desperate and profound, sat beside me, her shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly, a fragile tremor that nonetheless broadcast her immense pain. Her face, tear-streaked and drawn, was turned towards the simple wooden crucifix on the wall, her gaze unwavering, fixed, a testament to a faith so profound it seemed to defy the very laws of grief and finality that held sway in the world beyond these walls. I wondered, looking at her, where she found such an inexhaustible wellspring of hope, how she could cling to the unseen when the seen was so crushingly definitive. Around us, the handful of parishioners who had joined us, Mrs. Rodriguez from the Altar Society, her usually bustling hands now clasped tightly in prayer, old Mr. Henderson, whose gnarled hands told tales of decades of work at the hardware store and who had always kept a quiet, compassionate eye on Maria's struggles, and a young couple Mark had once, ironically, helped with a property dispute. Their faces, pale with shock, remained kneeling, their heads bowed. Their presence was a silent affirmation, a collective sigh of spiritual solidarity against the cold, hard facts of the world, a fragile circle of human hope drawn against the encroaching shadow of death. Their shared silence was not empty, but filled with unspoken prayers, each breath a wordless offering. The scent of old wood, emanating from the worn pews and the altar, mingled with the faint fragrance of incense that lingered stubbornly from a previous mass, a ghost of holiness. These familiar, comforting aromas were subtly yet insistently pierced by the metallic tang of hospital antiseptic that always seemed to find its way through even the thickest doors and into the quietest corners. The soft, muted glow from the single stained glass window, depicting St. Jude himself, the patron saint of lost causes and desperate situations, cast muted, gentle colors, a bruised purple, a melancholic blue, a hopeful gold, across the worn kneeler where I rested. His image, often invoked in moments of profound despair, seemed particularly poignant now, a silent question mark hanging in the dim light. My own rosary, its smooth, cool beads now still in my hand, felt like a familiar anchor in a sea of turbulent thought, a tangible connection to centuries of prayer and tradition. Yet, even that anchor seemed insufficient against the crashing waves of doubt that now threatened to overwhelm me. I had prayed for countless souls at the hour of their death. It was a sacred duty, a solemn privilege, a task I had undertaken countless times over the decades of my priesthood. I had stood at bedsides, murmuring the final prayers, anointing with oil, offering the Church's ancient comfort to the dying and their grieving loved ones, feeling the grace of God flow through me. But this felt different. This was not the peaceful passing of a devout soul, slipping gently into the arms of a merciful God, nor even the tragic sudden departure of one whose life, though perhaps imperfect, had been lived with some measure of faith, some acknowledgement of the divine. No, this was Mark Bishop. I was praying for Mark Bishop, I was praying for a man who had not merely strayed from the flock, but who had actively, vehemently, and often publicly rejected God's love at every turn. My mind reeled back through the years, a painful kaleidoscope of memories. I remembered Maria's tearful confessions, her quiet agony over Mark's escalating disdain for anything sacred, her whispered laments in the hushed confessional about his latest blasphemy, his latest cruelty. I recalled his cynical remarks, sharp as broken glass, about the church being a crutch for the weak, his dismissive waves of the hand when I tried to engage him in even the simplest conversation about faith or community. He had built his empire on ambition and ruthlessness, his worldview seemingly devoid of charity, compassion, or spiritual introspection. He was a man who saw the world in stark, transactional terms, profit and loss, strength and weakness. God, he seemed to believe, had no place in his meticulously kept ledger, no role in his self-made success. He had actively scorned, mocked, and dismissed the very source of comfort and meaning that Maria held so dear. Could a lifetime of such profound and unrepentant rejection truly be washed away by a few whispered Hail Marys? Could our collective prayers, offered in sincerity and love, penetrate the hardened shell of a soul that had so steadfastly turned its back on grace? The question hung in the silence of the chapel, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my spirit. My theological training, my years of study, my very understanding of divine justice and mercy seemed to wrestle within me, creating a painful internal discord. On one hand, the Church teaches of God's infinite mercy, a boundless love that extends even to the last breath, to the very edge of eternity. The parable of the 11th-hour laborer, who receives the same wage as those who toiled all day. The thief on the cross, granted paradise in his final moments. These were potent reminders that salvation is not a reward earned through perfect adherence, a meticulously tallied score, but a gift freely given to those who, even at the very end, turn their hearts towards God. This was the bedrock of my faith, the message I preached, the solace I offered. But had Mark, in those final violent moments of his collapse, turned his heart, or had his last conscious act been one of defiance, of dismissing his son's desire for confirmation as superstitious nonsense before succumbing to the sudden, brutal grip of death? The thought was a painful knot in my stomach, a cold dread that coiled within me. I found myself grappling with a dangerous presumption, the idea that I, a mere priest, could somehow judge the state of a soul before God. It was hubris, I knew, a trespass into divine judgment, but an almost involuntary one. How could I reconcile the gentle, loving God I knew, a God whose compassion I had witnessed countless times, with the apparent reality of a man like Mark Bishop, whose life seemed to embody everything antithetical to faith, being granted a swift, unburdened passage into his presence? It felt like a contradiction, a test of the very tenets I had dedicated my life to upholding, a fissure opening in the foundation of my own understanding of divine order. Maria beside me was a living embodiment of pure faith, and her presence was both a source of inspiration and an additional pressure. Her prayers were not for a man deserving of mercy, for she knew his flaws perhaps better than anyone, but for a man desperately in need of it. Her love for Mark, despite his flaws, despite his cruelties, was an icon of Christ's own unconditional love, a testament to a grace that human beings are capable of mirroring. She prayed not out of judgment, but out of a profound hope that transcended human understanding, a pure, unyielding love that burned fiercely even in the face of death. If her faith could be so steadfast in the face of such overwhelming sorrow, what right did I have to waver? What justification could I find for my own insidious doubts? Yet the clinical reality down the hall was a relentless antagonist to the spiritual hope in our chapel. The silence that followed our amen felt heavy with defeat. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of acceptance, the gentle hush of spirits commended to God, but the hollow stillness of a battle lost, an echo of the flat line in the ER. The air seemed to vibrate not with grace, but with the raw, tangible fact of death, its cold certainty of physical presence. Each tick of the invisible clock stretched, mocking our fragile shield of prayer. 47 minutes. A life had ceased. Her story, by all conventional measures, had ended. My hands, still clutching the rosary, felt cold, despite the warmth of the chapel. My gaze drifted from Maria's resolute profile, an image of unwavering devotion, to the small flickering votive candles before the statue of the Blessed Mother. Their flames danced, tiny defiant beacons against the encroaching shadow that seemed to deepen with each passing moment. Were they prayers ascending, tiny sparks of hope reaching towards the heavens, or were they merely the last vestiges of hope struggling against the inevitable, destined to gutter out in the face of immutable reality? I felt a profound weariness settle into my bones, a spiritual exhaustion that seeped into my very being, heavy and inescapable. The burden of priesthood often entails carrying the doubts and fears of others, guiding them through darkness with the steady lamp of faith. But in that moment, in the hushed aftermath of our prayers for Mark, I felt my own faith being tested to its limits, threatened by the very questions I had sought to answer for others. The logical part of my mind, trained in the rigors of theological debate, struggled to find an answer, a pathway through this apparent contradiction between a righteous God and an unrepentant man. The spiritual part of me, steeped in years of pastoral care and a deep abiding love for God, simply clung to the whisper of mercy, a faint, almost imperceptible sound in the cacophony of my doubts. The silence grew, thick and suffocating. It was not the reverent silence of contemplation, but the oppressive stillness of an unspoken question hanging in the air, pressing in on all sides. Was it enough? Had our prayers, our communal plea, truly pierced the veil that separated life from death, the earthly from the divine? Or were we simply clinging to a beautiful illusion, a comforting fiction, while down the hall, the grim, unyielding reality of death asserted its final uncontestable dominion over Mark Bishop's body and perhaps his soul? The clinical reality and the spiritual hope were at war, and in that moment, with the silent hospital pressing in, the weight of defeat felt overwhelmingly present, a bitter taste in the mouth of my spirit. The world, it seemed, had won. God's mercy for this one man felt like a prayer unanswered, a silent void where grace should have been. The silence that had settled upon us in the hospital chapel was not merely a lack of sound. It was a physical weight pressing in, an unseen shroud draped over our hopes. My spirit, so recently buoyant with the act of prayer, now felt crushed beneath an edifice of cold, clinical fact. The world, it seemed, had indeed won. God's mercy for this one difficult man felt like a prayer unanswered, a silent void where grace should have been. I knelt there, my rosary beads still clutched in my hand, the wood feeling strangely cool against my palm, as if even the sacrament had been chilled by the bleak reality of death. Then, without warning, the stillness shattered. It began with a distant, sharp bark of a sound, an almost primal cry that ripped through the quietude of the hospital corridors. It was a woman's voice, unmistakably a scream, laced with an urgency and a terror that coiled instantly in my stomach. Maria, who had been bowed in silent prayer beside me, flinched violently, her head snapping up. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen from tears, darted towards the chapel door, reflecting the same nascent fear that now flickered within my own heart. What new sorrow could possibly befall us now? Had something happened to another patient? Or was it, God forbid, the final, irrevocable news regarding Mark? The scream was immediately followed by a frantic, percussive clatter, the distinctive, urgent sound of medical equipment being jostled, perhaps dropped, and then the hurried, heavy thud of multiple footsteps echoing down the sterile hallway. It wasn't the measured, respectful pace of staff preparing to move a body. No, this was a chaotic symphony of alarm, a cacophony that screamed, "Crisis!" Maria pushed herself up from the kneeler, her movement stiff, her face pale, a silent question etched upon it. "Father, what?" she began, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with a fragile dread. Before I could even formulate a response, the chapel door burst open. A young nurse, whose name I vaguely recalled as Sarah, stood framed in the doorway, her face a mask of profound disbelief, her chest heaving as if she had run a great distance. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, seemed to look through us, not at us. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, a few strands clinging damply to her forehead. She clutched a clipboard to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white. "Father, Maria, you need to come," she gasped, the words tumbling out almost unintelligible. It's Mr. Bishop. The monitor, he's alive." The last word, alive, hung in the air, a bell tolling a truth so impossible, so utterly contradictory to everything we had just resigned ourselves to, that it felt like a deliberate lie, a cruel jest. Maria's breath hitched, a strangled sound of disbelief and desperate hope. Her eyes, which moments before had held only the weary resignation of grief, now blazed with a fierce, almost terrifying intensity. She didn't wait. She bolted from the chapel, a woman possessed, her slight frame fueled by a sudden, inexplicable surge of adrenaline and faith. I followed, my own legs feeling like lead, my mind reeling. Alive? How could he be alive? He had been gone, pronounced, confirmed. I stumbled out of the chapel, the fluorescent lights of the corridor harsh after the chapel's dimness. The sounds from the ER were now louder, a frantic orchestration of voices, beeping machines, and the low hum of medical technology under duress. As we neared Mark's room, the chaos intensified. Doctors and nurses, their faces a mix of professional urgency and outright stupefaction, swarmed the area. The air crackled with a palpable energy, an electric current of the impossible made real. I pushed past a gurney, my eyes scanning for Mark, for any sign of what Sarah had so wildly claimed, and then I saw it. Through the shifting shoulders of a cluster of medical personnel, my gaze fixed on the cardiac monitor that had been left almost as an afterthought beside Mark's bed. Moments ago I had imagined that screen, cold and impersonal, displaying the chilling flat line of death. Now, impossibly, breathtakingly, the green line danced. It wasn't a chaotic, fibrillating jumble or the weak, struggling flutter of a heart attempting to restart. No, it was a perfect, rhythmic, undeniably steady sinus rhythm. A heartbeat, a strong heartbeat. Each peak and valley, a clear, bold testament to life. A gasp escaped my lips, a sound I hadn't known I was capable of making. It was a sound born of sheer, unadulterated awe, a gasp that transcended language and reason. My eyes darted from the monitor to the gurney. There on the gurney sat Mark Bishop. He wasn't struggling for breath, his chest wasn't heaving in the painful, ragged gasps of someone revived from the brink. He didn't cough or groan or blink confusedly into the harsh hospital lights. He simply sat upright, propped slightly against the raised head of the gurney, his posture remarkably serene. His eyes, which I had last seen closed in the lifeless pallor of death, were now open. They held a profound, calm clarity that seemed to drink in the stunned faces around him. There was no terror in them, no confusion, no sign of the catastrophic brain damage that should have been the inevitable consequence of 47 minutes without oxygen. Instead, they held a startling, almost beatific peace. The room, so recently a maelstrom of frantic activity, fell into an almost absolute silence. The only sound was the insistent rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor, a triumphant drumbeat proclaiming the impossible. Doctors, their stethoscopes still dangling around their necks, stood frozen, their professional composure utterly shattered. Their faces, usually so practiced in the stoicism of medical crisis, were etched with something far beyond mere surprise, an almost childlike wonder mingled with an adult physician's absolute intellectual bewilderment. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the seasoned emergency physician who had pronounced Mark's time of death, stood closest to him, her usually brisk demeanor replaced by an almost reverent stillness. She reached out a tentative hand as if to confirm he was real, then pulled it back as if burned. She looked at the monitor, then at Mark, then back at the monitor, her brow furrowed in a deep crease of incomprehension. She was a woman of science, of empirical data, of irrefutable fact. And what she was witnessing defied every single one of those principles. "It's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a raw, almost guttural admission of scientific defeat. Her words were not a question, but a statement of absolute certainty, spoken by a mind wrestling with an undeniable yet utterly illogical truth. There was no heartbeat, no respiration, no brain activity. 47 minutes. There should be severe anoxia, brain death. He should be dead. But he wasn't. Mark Bishop, the man who had been a monument to pride and worldliness, the man whose heart had ceased to beat for 47 minutes, the man whose soul we had just commended to God's mercy, sat before us alive. And not just alive, but lucid, perfectly, impossibly lucid. My own mind struggled to reconcile the scene before me with everything I knew of life, death, and medicine. My faith, which had felt so bruised and battered in the chapel, now surged through me like a powerful river breaking through a dam. This was not a medical anomaly. This was not a spontaneous remission or an error in judgment. This was an intervention, a profound, direct, undeniable touch of the divine. Maria, who had finally reached the threshold of the room, stood beside me, her hands clasped tightly over her mouth. Tears streamed down her face, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy, of a faith so steadfast it had, against all odds, wrestled a soul back from the very jaws of death. She met my gaze, her eyes shining with an unspeakable gratitude, a quiet triumph. In that moment, her unwavering prayers, her fierce devotion, felt like the very instrument of this impossible resurrection. The silence in the room stretched, pregnant with the weight of the miraculous. It was a silence that spoke louder than any sermon, a silence that resonated with the presence of something utterly beyond human comprehension. The clinical reality and the spiritual hope which had been at war in my soul just moments before, were now aligned, perfectly and profoundly. The battle was over, and grace, pure, unmerited, magnificent grace, had unequivocally won. It wasn't just Mark Bishop who had been brought back to life. In that very instant, surrounded by the stunned disbelief of science and the silent awe of faith, my own spirit had been resurrected too. The bitter taste of defeat was gone, replaced by the sweet, overwhelming taste of a mystery unveiled, a divine promise affirmed, and a love that truly conquered all, even death itself. The immediate aftermath of Mark Bishop's impossible return was a symphony of disbelief and frantic activity in the ER, but for me, kneeling in the small chapel, the world had fallen into an absolute sacred quiet. My spirit, indeed, had been resurrected too. The bitter taste of defeat was gone, replaced by the sweet, overwhelming taste of a mystery unveiled, a divine promise affirmed, and a love that truly conquered all, even death itself. When the first frantic nurse from the ER burst into the chapel, gasping, He's awake, Father. He's asking for you," I found my legs stiff, my voice a whisper. Maria, however, sprang up, a radiant joy transforming her tear-streaked face. Her faith had pierced the veil. The walk back to Mark's room felt longer than the entirety of his 47 minutes of absence. Each step was a prayer, a silent catechism of my own heart. I passed doctors and nurses, their faces etched with a mixture of professional awe and bewildered shock. They spoke in hushed tones of spontaneous circulation and unprecedented neurological integrity, clinical terms struggling to contain the sheer, unadulterated miracle that pulsed through the hospital corridors. Science, for all its magnificent advancements, had run aground on the shores of something utterly supernatural. When I finally reached Mark's room, it was hushed, reverent. A small circle of medical personnel stood back, their gazes fixed on the man in the bed. He wasn't hooked up to the usual post-resuscitation menagerie of tubes and wires. Some, inexplicably, had already been removed. He sat upright, leaning against the pillows, his hospital gown pristine, his hands resting calmly on the white sheet. The Mark Bishop I knew, the one who carried himself with the swagger of a man who owned the world and felt entitled to crush anyone beneath his heel, was gone. Utterly, irrevocably gone. His face, once a roadmap of sharp angles and perpetual dissatisfaction, was soft, almost translucent. The lines of worry and ambition had vanished, replaced by a serenity that seemed to emanate from within, a gentle light radiating from his very pores. But it was his eyes that truly arrested me. They were no longer the flinty, calculating eyes that had dissected balance sheets and dismissed human emotion. They were wide, luminous pools, the color of a summer sky after a cleansing rain, reflecting a peace so profound it brought tears to my own eyes. There was no fear, no confusion, no frantic grasp for what he had lost, only a quiet, unwavering understanding. He looked not at the room but through it, as if the physical world was a thin curtain barely obscuring a deeper reality. When his gaze met mine, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was a smile utterly devoid of his old sarcasm, a smile of pure, unburdened grace. He extended a hand, a gesture of invitation rather than demand. "Father Michael," he rasped, his voice a whisper, yet strangely resonant. I have to tell you." I drew closer, pulling up a chair by his bedside, my heart pounding a rhythm of wonder against my ribs. Maria had already moved to the other side of the bed, her hand gently clasping his, her eyes brimming with a silent testament to a love that had defied even death. The doctors, sensing the sacred intimacy of the moment, quietly excused themselves, leaving us in a space that felt less like a hospital room and more like a hallowed sanctuary. When my heart stopped," Mark began, his voice gaining a fragile strength, "there was no pain, no darkness, just an immediate, overwhelming sense of being lifted, not physically but spiritually, like shedding a heavy cloak, and then a light. Father, you cannot imagine the light." He paused, his luminous eyes searching mine, seeking comprehension. It wasn't a light that blinded, but one that revealed everything. It was pure, distilled love. It washed over me, through me, leaving no corner of my being untouched. It was everything I had ever consciously rejected, and everything my soul had secretly yearned for. My mind raced back to the Mark Bishop I knew, the man who had mocked the very notion of spiritual love, who had dismissed faith as an opiate, and here he was, speaking of a love that transcended all earthly bounds. "There was no judgment," he continued, his voice barely audible, but vibrating with conviction. "No burning fires, no demons, none of the things I had secretly feared, the things I knew I deserved, only an embrace, a presence so vast and so loving that my entire life, with all its arrogance and cruelty, felt like a tiny, insignificant speck against its immensity. But it wasn't dismissive, it was welcoming. I leaned closer, my breath caught in my throat. "What did you see, Mark?" I asked, my voice equally hushed. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if replaying the scene in the theater of his renewed soul. "I saw her," he whispered, and a tender reverence filled the room. "The Blessed Mother. She was there, Father, not in some distant ethereal way, but as real as you are to me now. More real, in fact. Her presence was like a balm, a cool stream on a parched soul. She stood amidst this incredible golden light, her face aglow with a compassion that seemed to encompass all suffering, all humanity, and her smile, oh Father, her smile was the very face of God's mercy. It was a smile that forgave without a single word, that understood without a single explanation. He opened his eyes, and they were moist, reflecting the wonder he had witnessed. She didn't speak with words, not in the way we understand them. It was a communion of spirit, a transfer of knowing, and she pointed, not with her finger, but with a gentle tilt of her head, a sweep of her hand, towards a part of that golden light that pulsed with a particularly vibrant glow. It was a cascade, Father, a shimmering living waterfall of pure incandescent gold. Each droplet, each thread of light was alive, pulsing with warmth and grace. Mark swallowed, his gaze fixed on Maria, who was now openly weeping, her head bowed against his hand. "And she told me, Father, though not with sound. I simply knew it with every fiber of my being. She said, 'Those, my son, are the prayers of your wife. They are what called you here. They are what held you. They are what brought you back from the brink of eternal separation.'" A profound silence descended, broken only by Maria's soft sobs and the distant hum of hospital equipment. The weight of those words, spoken through a man who had scorned prayer, through the conduit of the Mother of God herself, settled upon my heart like a holy benediction. Maria's unwavering faith, her whispered Hail Marys in the chapel, had not been in vain. They had quite literally spanned the chasm of death, a bridge of pure love built across the darkest void. I didn't see my sins laid out like a ledger," Mark continued, his voice now imbued with a fragile authority. "There was no stern accounting, but I felt them. Oh, how I felt them. Not as a list of transgressions, but as the pain I had inflicted. I saw the ripple effect of my pride, my greed, my callousness. I felt the hurt I had caused Maria, our son, the people I had exploited. And it wasn't an external judgment, it was an internal revelation, a sorrow so pure, so deep that it cleansed me from the inside out. It was the sorrow of realizing how much love I had rejected, how much suffering I had unnecessarily created. It was repentance, Father, true agonizing, and ultimately utterly liberating repentance. He looked at me, a flicker of his old intensity in his eyes, but now it was an intensity born of spiritual truth, not worldly ambition. It wasn't a judgment, Father, it was an invitation to choose again, to choose the light, to choose love, to choose the path I had so arrogantly abandoned. And there it was, the lie I had first feared, as I recounted in the beginning of this impossible tale. I had feared that Mark, the unrepentant sinner, would spin a convenient fabrication, a beautiful lie to justify his unexpected return, a tale of heaven that defied God's justice. But as he spoke, as his luminous eyes held mine, I realized the lie was not his story. The lie was his former life. The lie was the cynicism that had armored his heart, the materialism that had blinded his soul, the pride that had driven him from God. That was the beautiful, magnificent lie he had been living, and it had just been utterly, unequivocally shattered by the truth of divine mercy. His experience was not a theological contradiction, it was the ultimate theological affirmation. It was not a scandal, it was a testament. God's justice, I understood now, was inextricably woven with his infinite mercy. And mercy, as Mark Bishop had just shown me, was boundless, reaching even into the stillness of death, guided there by the persistent, pure prayers of a loving wife. He had been shown not what he deserved, but what God desired for all his children, an invitation to return, to choose love, and to be cleansed by a sorrow that leads to life. A profound and humbling peace settled over me, deeper and more expansive than any understanding I had previously held. The mystery of faith had just been unveiled in the most personal and undeniable way possible. That profound and humbling peace, which had settled over me in Mark Bishop's hospital room, was just the beginning of a transformation that would ripple far beyond the sterile confines of St. Jude's Medical Center. The mystery of faith had indeed been unveiled, but its revelation was not meant for Mark and me alone. The news of his impossible return after 47 minutes of clinical death could not be contained within the hospital walls. It spread through our small town like wildfire, carried on the breath of nurses, the hushed tones of doctors, and the fervent whispers of our parishioners. The medical community, understandably, grappled with the inexplicable. I heard reports of specialists flying in, poring over Mark's charts, running every test imaginable. They published a paper, I believe, on prolonged post-mortem resuscitation with spontaneous recovery, filled with cautious caveats and scientific jargon. But for all their meticulous examination, they had no medical explanation. Mark's brain was intact, his heart perfectly strong, his very being vibrant. He was to them a living, breathing anomaly, a statistical impossibility. For our parish of St. Jude, however, the explanation was clear, written not in algorithms or waveforms, but in the indelible script of divine love. We had prayed, not for a reversal of death, but for the soul of a difficult man, and God, in his boundless mercy, had answered in a way that defied all human understanding. The Mark Bishop who walked out of the hospital a week later was not the same man who had collapsed in the midst of a tirade. The ruthlessness that had defined his eyes was replaced by a gentle, searching gaze. The cynical edge in his voice softened into a measured thoughtfulness. He reconciled with Maria, not with apologies born of obligation, but with a profound, tearful humility that brought her to her knees in gratitude. He held his son, holding him as if for the very first time, seeing not a burden, but a precious, irreplaceable gift. His fortune, once the instrument of his ambition and pride, became a tool for redemption. He began quietly dedicating vast sums to the local shelters, to the food banks, to initiatives for affordable housing, the very things he once would have scoffed at as wasted money. His life, once a monument to self-aggrandizement, was now a testament to service, driven by a quiet, unwavering devotion that radiated from him like a gentle light. But perhaps the most powerful testament came when he stood before our parish, not in the hospital room but in the very sanctuary he once mocked. It was a Sunday morning, a few months after his return. He requested to speak after my homily, a request I granted with a mixture of trepidation and hope. The church was packed. Word had, of course, reached every corner of the town. He walked to the lectern, the same one from which I had heard his wife's tearful confessions of his behavior, the same one from which he would have once hurled insults at the superstitious nonsense within these walls. A hush fell over the congregation, thick with anticipation. Mark didn't boom or command. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost fragile, yet it carried an authority born not of worldly power, but of supernatural experience. He spoke of the unconditional love that had enveloped him, of Maria's prayers that had illuminated his path, of the profound sorrow he felt for the pain he had caused. He didn't preach, he simply bore witness. He didn't ask for belief, he offered his truth, raw and unadorned. His eyes, once hard and calculating, now held a depth of compassion that moved many to tears. His testimony, delivered with such quiet humility, resonated deep within the hearts of those who heard it. Over the next few months, I saw dozens of fallen-away Catholics, some who had been absent for decades, return to the church. They came seeking confession, seeking guidance, seeking to understand the love that could transform a man like Mark Bishop. Our pews filled, not with fear, but with a renewed sense of hope and wonder. The miracle was not just that a man's heart had been restarted. That was merely the outward sign, the jarring clap of thunder before the downpour. The true miracle was the conversion of a soul, a testament for all of us to see, a living parable walking among us. It was a divine reminder, echoing from the very heart of the Gospels, that no one, absolutely no one, is beyond redemption. It was a powerful, undeniable affirmation that the persistent, fervent power of intercessory prayer, offered with a pure heart, can indeed reach across the veil of death itself. And most profoundly, it was a living truth that God's love is a force infinitely more powerful than any law of science, any depth of human sin, or any perceived barrier of time or space. Mark Bishop, the man I once feared was a theological contradiction, became for me and for our entire parish the most beautiful, magnificent truth, that God's mercy truly knows no bounds, and His grace can mend even the most broken of hearts, making them beat anew, not just for this life, but for eternity.